This presentation is the West Bath presentation by Dr. Charles Burden. And as you can see from the title slide, it's on Birch Point's growth spurts, a pediatrician's perspective. Take it away, Charlie.
Thank you, Peter. The early history of the Birch Point area is quite fuzzy. The first thing we know much about at all is a man named Bill Lord, a retired sailor, and his wife, Eliza. They bought the Peter Truman property in 1843, including a wharf, a fish house, and a home. And you'll see on this 1858 county map his place there. And at the same time, there's an Andrew Mann who has a farm down on the point. We're quite sure that Mann owned almost everything from here on down, and that Lord owned everything between there and Brigham's Cove, eventually. The wharf was a popular spot to boat and fish, and Lord started serving fried cunners and clams. I never had a fried cunner, but apparently it was very popular at the time. And he built a dining hall nearby his house in 1863, and then built a new home further up the road near what we now know as Red Pond. By 1869, he supposedly had about 150 acres. The same year, in 1879, William F. Crooker, a Bath livery, stable, and trucking firm owner, trucking then being by horse and wagon, of course, and nephew of important Bath shipbuilders Charles and William D. Crooker, he bought the Andrew Mann farm. Even though he still lived in Bath, he changed his occupation to a farmer. He also, we'll hear more about him later, actually. I have no idea who this Alley and McKinney's were that were there then. We haven't traced back to that far. We think the house that he built in 1869 was founded the cellar, the back part of this L of this hotel, which was built in front of it. That same year, 1879, that Crooker bought the Mann farm, Edward and Sarah Lewis from Portland convinced Bill Lord to sell them all his property for $1,000 and lifetime care for him and Aunt Eliza, he called his wife. The property had more encumbrances than Bill Lord had revealed, and a legal battle ensued the next year. A bonus for posterity survives from this battle, an inventory of the contents of the Lord residence, the boarding house known as Pleasant Point House at that time, the shoreside dining hall, and a fish house. It included over 100 objects in this list, sets of objects, among which were 10 beds, some of them feather beds, 4 chamber mugs, 5 washstands and bowls and pitchers, 5 spitbox rugs, how about that? 42 chairs and 12 settees, 2 wash tubs and a washboard, many tools, and in the fish house, a sailboat, 2 dories, and 2 iron cunner traps. An analysis of this list would make a great SBI program. Birchwood Hotel. Edward Lord died the next year, and Mrs. Lewis continued running the business, getting up suppers, as she called it, until 1893, when her profit-loss situation forced her to sell it. Meanwhile, she had dammed off a nearby stream, creating Shadow Pond, which we now know as Red Pond, and in 1887 split the hotel in 2, moving the front part down to the shore and renting it as a cottage. And she built a new Pleasant Point Hotel shown here. It was purchased along with most of the acres of land not already in cottage lots by two Bath doctors, Randall Bibber and Charles Rideout, in 1893. They operated it with the help of a succession of managers for several years, eventually closed it again because of lack of financial success. One day, June Rideout, widow of Dr. Rideout, came down to spend the night at the hotel, and the next morning, after she went out, the chimney and the fireplace she'd been using caught fire, and the building burned to the ground, never to be rebuilt. Mrs. Rideout had no insurance on her half interest, so no malicious intent was suspected. What happened to Mr. Crooker's farmhouse? Just disappeared. Anyway, the main house of this, without the L, was built in 1884 by William Crooker, and we think it may well have an enlargement of the Andrew Mann farmhouse, but we're not sure. There's no proof one way or the other. It's clear that it's not clear also whether eventually it became the property of his son-in-law, David Merry, and was sold by him along with about 200 acres, partly belonging to other children of Crooker, to J. Edward Drake Sr. in 1917. The L was added on in 1922 to put in a billiard room. Walter Norton, a retired employee of Torrey Roller Bushing Works, in about 1945, bought the farm and had a big garden and some lobster traps. Drake's son, Eddie, bought it back when Mr. Norton died in 1955 and sold it within a year or two to his friends Laura and Tommy Thomas, who are shown here with the Drakes. Laura's father owned Cooney's Sales in Marblehead, and Tommy oversaw their work at BIW, making canvas cot bottoms and awnings. Their daughter Lorraine Pluto inherited it, and since her passing a couple of years ago, her husband Joe has lived there alone. Dr. Bibber, whom we met a bit ago as half owner of the Birchwood Inn, bought the point of land next to Fanny's Nubble from Sarah Lewis in 1885 and built the first cottage built at Birch Point. Fred Drake Sr. stayed in an adjacent cottage a few times and convinced his father, James V. Drake of Bath, who was an owner of ships, steamboats, and an insurance agency, to buy the property in 1905. He inherited it along with his brother, J. Edward Drake, the following year when his father died. Fred Sr. was deeded the point in 1920, and his widow conveyed the cottage and the lot to their son, Ben Drake, in 1950. Ben's brother, Bill Drake, who had inherited the other half of the point, bought the Pierce property on the other side of the Sally Man Cove and traded it with his brother Ben so Bill could own the whole point. This is how the cottage looked in the early 50s when Bill Drake was actually living mostly in the other cottage behind it. Upon Bill's death, his son Jim bought out his siblings and converted the old Bibber cottage to a year-round home. So the first cottage built in Birch Point still stands inside this comfortable home and is owned by a member of a family that's owned the property for 109 years. Bibber sold the other half of the point to his friend Joseph Varney, who owned a sawmill in North Bath, for which Varney Mill Road is named, a couple of years after he built his own. This view shows the Varney cottage just being finished, with lumber still in the yard, and the Bibber cottage is there on the left. The Drakes bought it 18 years later when they bought the whole point, and it sits relatively unchanged today. Charles D. Emery, a wool merchant in Bath, bought a 50 by 100 foot lot from Sarah Lewis, likely because she was feeling a pinch from the difficulty of earning a living from a summer hotel, and built the cottage second from the left here, a sort of Queen Anne style, in 1889. It appears to have been owned by a Shattuck family from Boston next, and then James Savage. Roy Shackford, who married Savage's niece, Winsome Alice, who clerked at D.T. Percy's store in Bath, obtained it from Mr. Savage. Roy later owned a candy store in Bath and eventually became manager of the Bath Greenfront, the state liquor store. Apparently he believed candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. Upon Alice's passing in 1969, her daughter and husband Jeanette and John Green inherited it. It now belongs to the Green's granddaughter, Jonna, and her husband, Brian Stanton. The cottage on the far left was built by Thomas W. Hall, a traveling salesman from Bath, on an identical lot to Emery's, but in a completely different style. He purchased that from Bibber and Rideout in 1894. They had bought the land from Lewis, of course, right after they had obtained the land. The Hall cottage was bought by Oscar Williams, road commissioner and former boat builder in Bath, in 1903. His granddaughter, Ruth Butts, never got to visit there until her father inherited it in 1940, because Oscar didn't like children around. Ruth and her husband, John, have deeded over to their son, John, reserving the right to use it during their lifetimes, making the younger John the longest single family owning a land at Birch Point, now 111 years. The third cottage on the left was built in 1910 by Harry Richardson, who was brother-in-law of Oscar Williams and pipe shop foreman at BIW. His niece, Marion Redland Hunt, inherited it from him, and her husband, who survived her, sold it to the Mankeys, who in turn sold it to Christopher Benoist and Diane Mathis, who own it today. The cottage on the far right in the image from the 1930s is the Varney Drake place, once called Cliff Cottage, and you can see why. J.G. Washburn, a music store owner in Bath, had this cottage built east of the Williams cottage in 1895. You'll notice how many of these places are originally built by Bath people, and over the years, most of the cottages have claimed to be owned by people with Bath connections. It was bought by T. Joseph Swan, fire chief in Everett, Massachusetts, in 1906. Although Swan drowned fishing in Houghton's Pond in 1921, and I remember going to Houghton's Pond and picking lilies for my mother, and she had a fit because she still knew this story. His family continued to use it for several years. A Florence Chadwick purchased it in the mid-30s, and Esther Braun got it from her in 1940, and this image is from Esther Braun's time. Chuck Richelieu was the next owner, and Gary and Mandy Russell own it today, and this is a view from behind. Clara Hunt, sister of Dan Williams, who had been a stenographer at the Bath Daily Times, but was then employed at the Waltham Watch Company in Massachusetts, bought a tiny parcel of land about 1910 near where the road to the Brussels and Butts and so forth goes down from the main Birch Point Road. She and her husband George built this camp, and they were so happy with it when they finished they danced on the roof. The Oliver Ellises bought the camp in 1946, but unfortunately burned down a few years later. The Ellises rented the Stevens cottage, well, more I'll tell you later, for a couple of years, then bought land a lot next to them from the Drakes. And using this truck, they hauled logs they had cut to a sawmill in Chesterville, Maine, and brought the lumber back to Birch Point about 1948, and constructed this garage-like building first. Shortly thereafter, they began to build a cottage, which ended up looking like this. And the small cottage was enlarged in 1998 by Oliver Ellis Jr., who owns and enjoys the property today. D. Howard Spear, partner in the Kelly Spear Shipyard in Bath, built this cottage in 1886 on a double lot he bought from William C. Crooker. It was sold by his estate to a Frank Daniels in 1925, and Hap Talbot, half owner of Hilltop Market in Bath, purchased it from Daniels in 1939. Hap sold it to Larry Ryan. That's how it looked as the Talbots had it. Hap sold to Larry Ryan in 1956 and moved next door. The Ryans have since sold it to the John and Doris McCole heirs who still use it. William F. Crooker decided to go in the cottage rental business himself, and he built this cottage on his property about 1885. Wrong one. D.A. Mary, his son-in-law, built this cottage sometime in the 1880s to rent, selling it in 1913 to a J.P. Bartholomew, who quickly turned it over to a Seeley family. J. Edward Drake Jr. bought it from the Seeleys in 1926 and was used by his sons for a couple of years in the early 1930s while Eddie was constructing his cottage across the cove. In 1934, Leroy Burnham bought it, and in 1980 it was purchased by J.H. Miller, a Bath contractor. Miller made some improvements before it was rented for a season to C. Arthur Mayo of Bath in 1959 and sold to Mayo the following year. The Mayos have made extensive improvements, converting it to a year-round use which their son Rick now enjoys. Now we're at the Samuel Strout cottage. Originally apparently looked much like the Bibber cottage and built in 1886. He sold it to the Staples family in 1905. It was purchased by a D.H. Philbrook in 1932, and O.M. Redland bought it from Philbrook in 1938 and 39. The first summer, 3 families shared it, those of Mr. Redland's 2 children, Abbott Redland and Evelyn Burden, and their spouses, recently widowed sister, her 2 children from Orono. Total of 10 people. Can't imagine it. The Burdens, and there was no running water and no electricity. There was an outhouse in the corner of the barn in the back. The Burdens continued to use the Strout Staples cottage, with improvements of course, until the late 60s when they built a year-round home nearby, and they sold it to the Douglas Motts. Judy and Peter Larkin bought it from the Mott estate in 1994, and have made extensive improvements. This is how it looked when we had it and the Motts had it from behind, from the driveway, and how it looks today. Now, the next cottage we are going to talk about was built in 1885 to 1910 period and was built by Fred Silsby on the very point where Addison McGinnis now lives, or now has a cottage. A photo of that building exists, but I haven't been able to get my hands on it yet. Apparently it's in the cottage, and we'll get it in the spring. Francis O'Brien of Brookline, Massachusetts bought it from Silsby in 1914. In 1936 he sold it to Mrs. John H. Hyde of Bath. Mrs. Hyde had Harold DeLong, an out-of-work naval architect turned first-class carpenter, build this modernist cottage, one of the earliest structures built in this style in Maine. We're not sure, but we think they tore down the O'Brien cottage, and this is completely new. I've inquired all the likely sources to determine who may have designed the building without success. She also had him build a nautically themed pool house where he got to execute his ship cabin design talents, making it full of nautical themes and conveniences. This building was located next to a dammed-off cove, which served as a nifty saltwater pool. The whole property was sold to Archie Maine Sr., Vice President at BIW in 1945. Upon his death in 1960, the main house was inherited by his daughter Ellen McGinnis, who willed it to her son Addison, who occupies it today. The pool house was given to another daughter, Judy Whitehurst, who built an L in the back, as you can see. Her son Harry Haltman inherited it, added a second story, which he extended up over the hill in back of it. Harry's son Hank inherited it and built and lives there today. This shows it from the road up above. Now, William F. Crooker decided to get in the cottage rental business and built this cottage on the property in 1885. Eva Jewett owned it by 1909, and when she sold the land, cottage, and furnishings to a Gertrude Skidmore. Skidmore sold the whole thing to J. Edward Drake Sr. in 1912, and it became Mrs. Drake's cottage. When she passed away in 1934, her husband sold it to Edward de Alva True, owner of Hallett's Drugstore, whose granddaughter, Sally, is seen here below the place a couple of years later. It was inherited by Edward de Alva's son, Edward Dale True, in 1961, and sometime after his premature death, Edward Dale True's son, Edward de Alva True II, became the owner. His widow, Lynn True, owns it today. The only change in outward appearance in the past 80 years seems to have been at putting the steps on the side instead of down the front. So this shows the first growth spurt. All those little yellow buildings are cottages that were built between 1885 and 1910, except for the David Mary farm, which again may have been built during that period as well. We're just not sure if it wasn't the old man farm added to it. Now, for the next 20 years, between 1910 and 1930, no cottage lots were sold or built upon. However, during this period, J. Edward Drake Sr. and his brother Frederick E. Drake Sr., shown here with their father James B. Drake, whose fortune they inherited, bought up all the undeveloped land, setting the stage for the next growth spurt. You see, J. Edward Drake bought the Mary farm, except for the cottages or lots that had already been sold. He and his brother Fred Sr. Bought the rest of the property except for Green Point. In 1930, they started selling cottage lots again. Wrong way. Frank Thompson bought a lot from Jedward Drake in 1930 and built this cottage. He sold it to Percy Lowe in 1938, who put on 2 additions over the years. Ellen Lowe Doran Sanborn came into possession of the property on her parents' passing and built a new home closer to the road where she lives today. Her sons Peter and John, I understand, used a shoreside cottage. Thomas Pierce bought this lot from his friend Frederick Sr. and had Harold DeLong build this cottage in 1934. Mr. Drake's son Bill bought the cottage from the Pierces, as I told you, and traded with his brother Ben for the Bibber cottage. Ben Drake's daughters, Robin and Margaret, now own the place. In 1934, J. Edward Drake Jr., whom we know as Eddie, constructed this cabin, cutting the trees, stripping off the bark, notching and fitting them himself. He built the chimney with rocks he collected around the place. It was a cozy little place, as this later view shows. Sadly, in 1974, the cottage burned down one night with Eddie and his wife Carolyn still in it. His grandson Michael, shown here putting the finishing touches on, built a new home on the site in 2003, and he enjoys living there today. Carolyn Drake's parents, Chester and Vivian Plant, built a similar-looking cottage on the next point. Reverend and Mrs. Dwight Cart bought the property in 1970 and made several improvements. After passing to the hands of John Neff, it was purchased by the Proctors, who have made extensive alterations and live there today. Frederick E. Drake Jr. built a camp, if you're going to call it that, on his father's property in the mid to late 30s. After marrying his wife Elena, he sold it to his brother Bill a few years later, Elena preferring to summer on the Cape or the Jersey Shore. Bill tore the camp down, I can understand why, and sold the property to Bud and Mary Giles in 1954. The Giles had Judd Miller build a cottage the same year. In time, they tore down the west half and built the 2-story addition shown here, winterizing the whole thing at the same time. The property was inherited by their children, Pete and Olive known locally as Pokey, in 2005. Pete took over his parents' cottage, and Olive started building a new one designed by Frank Roberts. And there's the finished cottage. Bartlett Smith, a Bath taxi service owner, not up to the guards, of course, built this cottage on a lot he bought from J. Edward Drake Sr. in 1940. It was sold to Dr. Donald Preble in 1946 when this view of the Birch Point Daredevils was taken. The Prebles sold it to Dawn and Herb Lilly in 1969. Abbott Redland in 1940 built this cottage in an adjacent lot to what became the first Burden cottage, which, aside from an addition put on in the late 40s, looks about the same today under the ownership of Abbott's granddaughter, Susan Broomhead, and her husband, Ted. Abbott's father, O.M. Redland, bought 2 additional lots east of this from J. Edward Drake soon thereafter, and he built this little cabin just as World War II was beginning and building supplies were limited. Upon his death in 1955, his daughter Evelyn Burden inherited and gave it to her son Bruce, who used it for several years, then sold to Marion and Dick Redland, who enlarged it and have since given it to their son Stephen. At the end of the war, O.M. Redland built this cottage and installed a pulpit down below it. This was for preaching to the fish. And it's shocking today, but in those days we used to always throw our garbage overboard, and this is a handy place to do it. His cottage was inherited by his son Abbott and in turn by his son Dick Redland. Dick and his wife Marion built an addition and winterized the place, eventually altering it considerably so it had this appearance by the time it was sold to Dr. Gary Zatarian in 2010. Hap Talbot sold the lot adjacent to the Spear Daniels cottage that he had recently purchased to his business partner and brother-in-law, Bob Linnican, who built this cottage in 1940. An addition was put on a few years later. I remember Ed Thompson from West Bath and Ernest Williams from Campbell's Pond being the carpenters for this job. After Bob died, his widow Mary rented it to John and Skippy Miller Allen for a year and Warren and Esther Hawley another year in the mid-50s. Then the Talbots sold their cottage and bought this one from, Mary Linnican. After Hap's death, Kate sold it to the Stuart Chapmans. Chapman's estate sold it to Andy Lamborn. And this is how it looked when Andy had it. He made some alterations, and in 2012, the Larkins bought it and spruced it up considerably. O.M. Redland bought all the undeveloped land south of the Smith-Preble-Livy property from J. Edward Drake in 1943. He sold off lots to many of his business associates over the next couple of years, and another building boom began. Alden Denham, Bath contractor, former BIW pattern maker, built this cottage on a lot just west of the Hyde, Maine cottage, and it was sold by his family to Archie Maine Jr. in 1957. Maine enlarged and winterized it, as seen on the right in this aerial view. His son Charles inherited it and sold it a couple of years later to Brad and Debbie Menschneider. Randall Murray bought the first lot after the Denhams that was sold. This was along the river. He never built but sold to his brother-in-law Alva Morse, who had this house moved down from Winnegans when Ruth Morse's sister Susie Waterhouse Black replaced it with a new house. And Alva had it set on that lot, and this is Alva's traps at the time. It was used at first by his daughter Patsy as a bedroom. In 1965, after Patsy married John Norton, It was incorporated into a home they built. That's Patsy and John. Alva Morse, a Bath heating contractor, bought the next lot north in 1944 and built this camp, which he named We Doed It. Alva had a speech problem. He stuttered, and my brother Bruce also stuttered. When Alva came to the house to fix the oil burner once, when Bruce was 4 or 5 years old, Bruce pointed to him and said, "You stutter." Wonderful guy, Alva. Next thing, they had a road built, now known as the Loop Road, built into the lots that the brethren had sold them. Here they're coming from the road to the Hyde Cottage, and here we are at the other end, building up to the Lowe's Road. The Morses moved We Doed It nearer the shore and put an addition on over the subsequent years. That's how it looks winterized. Bert McCabe, a wonderful old plumber customer of Posey's. Owen Redden was called Posey by his friends. His mother gave him that name. I don't know how he stood it. Bought the lot next north and built this tiny cottage he and Lizzie and their foster child Fran Rush used. Fran and her husband David Norton inherited the cottage and began to enlarge it, but decided to sell it instead. The building was disassembled and the property split between the Morses and the Doyles, who were butters. The next lot north of McCabe's went to Randall Cook, who was cashier at Bath National Bank, where Mr. Redland was a director. He began building his cottage in 1946. This is how it looked when completed when Charlie Doyle, Bath Bus Company owner, bought it in 1956. The Doyle's daughter Nancy Ginger Smith, now Garside, inherited it in 1969. In 1976, the Smiths moved back from New Hampshire and did a major renovation. The next lot north was sold to Earl Wade, Posey's dentist, who never built on it. It's now owned by the Garsides as well. Next lot beyond that was sold to a good friend of Archie Wishart, who was the brother of Isa Lowe, and the abutter of this lot, whose name was Carl Langman. He was a naval architect at BIW. The Langmans cleared the lot, as most people had to do, but this is the only picture we have of people doing that. Then they bought an abandoned two-car garage on Cottage Street in Bath, dismantled it, and marked each piece, even saving the roofing and the nails, which little Georgie Langman collected and straightened. They hired Herb McIntyre to take the materials in his garbage truck to their lot, where they re-erected it. Employing used stone windows facing the river where the garage doors had been, last lot sold by O.M. Redland during this period went to Lenny Haynes, proprietor of Bath Laundry, who built this cottage, which was equipped with a rain barrel to collect rainwater from the roof. Now, any of you remember that song? Playmate, come out and play with me, and bring your dollies 3. And something like, look down my rain barrel, slide down my cellar door. Well, there's a rain barrel. Eddie and Grace Jones bought a cottage built in a lot sold to Chet and Anna Stevens by J. Edward Drake sometime in the 30s. The cottage built by the Stevens was bought by Peter Stewart of Ventnor, New Jersey, who fixed it up quite a bit. The Jones added a garage on the land. This shows it in another view. And they sold it to Anne Marie Evo of California, who completely rebuilt it. It's currently owned by Jeff Cohen and Nancy Heiser. So we've completed the next growth spurt from 1930 to 1945, and all the purple or bright pink buildings are those built during that period. Just south of the Stephen Stewart Evo Cohen cottage, Jones, I guess, should have been there too. There was one built by Charles Shaw of Bath, as far as we know. He was an electrician at BIW about 1946. Peter Stewart bought that one as well, but split the property when he sold some to the Joneses. And Mike and Teal Hugo, who lived in Washington, D.C., where Mike served as a staffer in the House of Representatives, bought it, and they own it today. The Morses, John G. Sr. and John G. Jr., shown here with the third generation, John the Fourth. They bought all the timberland that was owned by J.E. and F.E. Drake, anticipating a continued need by BIW for staging timber and so forth during the war. In 1951, John G. Jr. began to sell shore lots. The first was to Frank Thompson in 1951. Oops, I'm sorry. Frank Thompson in 1951, who built this log cabin-style cottage on the Winnegans Bay side. In 1955, he sold it to his Birch Point neighbor, Edward D. True I, who allowed his newly wed granddaughter, Sally, and her husband, Bill Haggett, to use it starting the following year. When Bill got out of the service in 1960, they took possession of it, and in 1996, when Bill retired as CEO of Irving Shipyard in St. John, New Brunswick, they had Morong Construction, who was employing their son Sam at the time, build him a year-round home. In 1952, Morse sold a lot to Stan Hunter, who had been production manager at Oakhurst Dairy and maybe by now was city health officer, who built this cottage currently owned by his daughter Ruth and her husband Don Page. It has not been modified in the exterior since, except that it's been shingled over the sheathing. Sorry I don't have a better picture. Next, a lot was sold to Harry Ring. Yes, I did. One more. The Bath City Clerk. And it was on the other side of Merry Cove 5 years before a road was built into there. So with lumber, we brought over, that's me standing in a t-shirt. We took over on a float, got the cottage built, and is now owned relatively unchanged by Steve and Kathy Butner. In 1954, Morse sold a lot, I should say Moss because I'm talking about Mainers, sold an adjacent lot to the Hunters to William and Doris Hanson, who built a cottage, which they subsequently enlarged and sold to Bruce Farnham in 1988. I do have an image of this place today, but I placed it out of sequence. You'll have to wait a while to see it. The next images were photographed from an 8mm home movie supplied by Bill Green Jr., and they leave a lot to be desired in clarity. But it's a wonderful document on how to build a cottage in the wilderness. And if anybody wants to do it someday, we hope to actually show the movie clip in September rather than photographs taken from it. Here they are, if you can use your imagination, with a truck full of gravel being followed by a bulldozer building a road in there. The car was following the bulldozer. And there's Norm Seekins. Norm and Bill were good friends and built the cottages together side by side. Well, not awfully close, but adjacent lots. There's Norm mixing cement. Norm was a very experienced Bath contractor. And there is Bill pouring the forms for the posts. Bill at the time, I believe, was in partnership with his brother running Falls Shoe Store. Seekins still owns that's getting the joists up. Sluicing the cottages were down the hill from the road, and they sluiced the lumber down. There's Judy Green pounding the floor. And they carried supplies in the winter in the toboggan. And there they are building. One's house is on the right, one's on the left. There they are completed. Harry Rings on the right, then Seekins, then Green. The Geigers, who were actually the Greens, rented the cottage for a few years, and Bill and his wife Judy got tired of preparing for renters and convinced their mother to sell the place. And it was sold to Bill's boss, Jeff Geiger, and his wife Margie in 2005. The Geigers loved the location, but wanted a more comfortable building, so they pretty much took down the Green cottage except for one wall and the footprint as code required, and built a place that suited them. And this is the beginning of demolition. That's Colin Geiger at work. There's the new building going up. And here it is completed. The Morses next sold a lot to Mark King, manager of Newbury's 5 and 10 in Bath. They built a cottage, but the children don't seem to have any photos of it. It's my understanding it was purchased by Elliot Ashley and sold to somebody who moved the building to Phippsburg, but I failed to contact Mr. Ashley to obtain more details. I've been working on this project for a few hours most days since Jane Moss pressured me into accepting this assignment in early November. But I still haven't been able to reach all the parties involved. In 1955, Frank Sparks Jr. bought a lot on the Bayside from his uncle Owen Redland. He began to build a cottage the same year. Here it is finished with his sons Mike and Frank sitting in the doorway. His son Frank inherited it and found the sills very rotten, making replacing it with a new building most practical. So Frank hired Kevin Alexander from Pittsburgh to build him a new home on the site for year-round use. And here it is today, quite a showplace. Frank Sparks Sr. built a cottage across the road. He's shown here doing his own masonry. This cottage was inherited by his granddaughter Diane Sparks Hathorne, and when she no longer needed it, Rick Mayo bought it, tore it down to complete the buffer zone on the opposite side of the road from his place. Barbara and Linwood Temple bought a lot from John in 1957. Linwood was the chemist, I believe, at Bath Iron Works, and responsible for the Bath Waterfront Park. It was since inherited by their son Bruce, whom I have not been in touch with yet, but I'll get more images by the fall. This is how it looks today. In 1961, a lot was sold to Lewis and Nancy Kingsbury, who built a cottage, later purchased by Dan Donovan. Dan has promised me photos the past 5 weeks. I haven't appeared in my mailbox yet. Someday. J.P. and Sandy Foster bought the property from Dan in 2010, but I don't have any images of it, unfortunately. In the 1960s, when business was slow for contractors and John owned Bath Lumber Company, he had a contract to build 3 cottages on spec. First was this A-frame, now owned and enlarged by John and Jackie Gearing from East Hampton, Long Island, New York. And then he had built what is now Joe and Joan McColl's place, selling it to them in 1970. The McColls had winterized the building, upgraded the interior, and maintained the outside much as it looked when they purchased it. The last of the spec buildings was sold to Frank Danforth over time. Frank is a very accomplished carpenter, and I've heard from on good authority the inside has been beautifully finished, and the outside will be brought up to grade soon. In 1966, Paul and Donna McColl bought this lot, and soon after built a log cabin-style cottage on it. In 1967-68, they jacked it up and put a foundation under it. And they also extended the foundation for a new addition. And they have a beautiful home there today. In 1966, a lot was sold to an officer stationed at Brunswick Naval Air Station, but he never built on it. John and Kathleen Kelly bought the lot from someone in Florida in 2007, which may have been the same party. And they've been constructing this very handsome place since. In In 1969, Norm Seekins built this year-round home for my parents, Alex and Evelyn Burden, on land my mother inherited from her father, O.M. Redland. My father died a few years later. My mother outlived her second husband even, George Barker, who had been an old high school beau, who was very attached to her. And she lived until 2002, at which time her heirs, my brother, Bruce, my niece, Niobe, and I, decided to sell it to Sandy and Daniel Ingraham. Oh, I'm sorry. They improved it immensely, and it's currently on the market for $1.2 million. Paulie Redland, who owned the area inside the Loop Road, sold a lot to Carl Langman in 1968 to begin building a place for his son George, who eventually retired from his position at Salem State Teachers College in Massachusetts and finished the home that he and Carol enjoy today. I slipped up and failed to get an image of their place. So, at the end of the next boom, 1970, this is from 1946 to 1970, there are all these green cottages that have been built. As you can see, there's not much buildable shoreland left. In 1970, the roads were paved, paving the way, so to speak, for property owners to live at Birch Point all year. The dirt road being so muddy previously, residents could only access their places on foot several months a year. Now about half the property is occupied year-round. The Birch Point Village Corporation was founded in 1917 at the instigation of J. Edward Drake Sr. because the roads were poorly maintained by West Bath and a portion of the taxes paid to them. Shore owners paid relatively a lot more than in the inland farmers. 60% of the taxes paid came back to the village now, and they were responsible for upkeep of the roads. However, by 1970, when families began living there year-round, the cost of schooling raised its ugly head, and the corporation dissolved. Now West Bath keeps all the taxes, but they pay for schooling and the residents' children and maintaining the roads. And I haven't heard too many complaints since it got paved. Occasionally washes out. But Birch Point annual meetings continue to be held at various residents' homes for discussions of mutual concerns and socialization. Since 1970, Buzz and Jane Perry have built a cottage just north of the Hyde lot, since converted to a year-round home on the northernmost lot owned by a family, as I started to say. It's now owned by Kate and Chris Bouton, I believe. And here's the Hanson Farnham place. Bruce Farnham built this garage on the Hanson property, and the former house, he says, is pretty much as it was when he bought it. Elliot Ashley built this house next door to Farnham's, and is now presently owned by Rick and Gail Woods. As far as I know, Ashley built it, but maybe the Woods did most of the work. I have no idea. The last major transfer began about 25 years ago when Bud Guild, having become enamored of the property to the east of his known as Green Point, and began to try to buy it from the heirs of John and Emma Campbell, who had purchased it in 1881. One heir was Florence, a nurse living in Bath, widow of the Campbell's son, John, who willingly sold her half to Bud's mother, Olive Boyd Guild, who was the banker in these transactions. But it was like pulling teeth to get Elizabeth Deering Moffat, daughter of John Campbell's sister, Annie, who had married Carol Deering of Bath. Finally, Bud's mother was able to obtain title to the efforts of Bud in the late 1960s. Bud's mother died in 1974, and with some juggling among heirs, Bud ended up owning the property. He loved wandering over the acreage and decided it should be preserved undeveloped. So I believe in 2004, he concluded negotiations with Kennebec Estuary Land Trust, transferring the title to them so it will remain forever wild. This tract of land is known as Green Point Preserve and is open to the public for exploring. It also serves as a nice buffer between the proper folk at Birch Point and the riffraff on the other side of the tract. In Brigham's Cove. How'd you like that, Avery? Now we're going to talk a little bit about businesses at Birch Point. I guess I've still got 10 or 15 minutes. Burden and Talbot Contractors were a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old doing a little landscaping down there. And we had this tent as our business headquarters. And a lot of people down there lobstered. Bill Drake lobstered in the 1920s, sold lobster to his parents for 40 cents a pound. Now this is me going lobstering on a rainy day. I joined forces with Eddie True, shown here, and I built this wharf, and Eddie had a lobster boat, so we became partners, and we had 150 traps that we tended, which was a lot in those days. This is Eddie's lobster boat. He bought it from Morris Libby, I believe, who went lobstering with Nate Watson in Meadowbrook. Unfortunately, my younger brother's friends used to hang out at the wharf. We just hope that Bud at Pete Giles' pipe isn't lit. There's always logging going on at Birch Point, usually just when cottage lots were being cleared or roads were being made. This is a crew. Apparently John Morse didn't have horses himself, but he hired these horses to log right after the Hurricane Carol in 1950. People had parties at Birch Point. This is a clam bake held for the directors of the First National Bank of Bath in September of 2010. The list of attendees is quite impressive. George P. Davenport was the richest man in Bath at the time, probably. G.G. Deering was a shipbuilder. G.C. Moses, Galen C. Moses, and Oliver Moses down below were sons of the shipbuilder. Very well-to-do. Oliver owned Warumbo Wooling Mills in Lisbon Falls. Judge Dunton was there. C.V. Myatt, a Pittsburgh shipbuilder. And the two Drakes, Frederick E. and J. Edward Sr., as well as Charles Magoon, who was a naval architect, grandson, I believe, of Bath's first mayor and shipowner. Kids had parties too, and this is Frank Talbot and Charlie Burden and Dick Redlin and Bruce Burden having a little picnic in Talbot's backyard. People had fun. This is a great view of the horseshoeing at the Trues. On the far left is Mr. Ed True the first. On the far right is Edward Dale True, his son. I believe in the front and the middle is Edward Dale True the third generation, and he's flanked by Jimmy and John Preble. The Prebles are having a crab fest, I guess, with Margaret and Joe Long here. The Langmans were having a nice outing in front of their cottage. You can see the Low cottage next door. This is Alva Morse and George Como, I believe. Someone else can confirm that. Charlie Doyle and Bert McCabe horsing around. Anyone know who the guy in the front is?
Reg Farnham.
Reg Farnham? Thank you. And I'll conclude the parties with the Haggett clam bake, which is always a very impressive and wonderful affair. Swimming was the next important thing besides partying. And this shows swimming at Jenny's Nubble, Abbott Redland's boat built by, I think, Chuck Riddle up in Dresden in the background. There was an attempt at one time to have topless bathing in Birch Point, the way they do in Europe. Ellen Lowe was willing to do it, but apparently Sally True also did this, but she wasn't willing to let me use her photograph. in this wonderful guest book that still survives from the Drake Varney Cottage from 1910 to 1920s, you'll see, you can't see it very well, but down the bottom two entries, of June 11th and June 18th, there's J. Edward Drake, and then it says Dory. And on the other side of it, it says someone else's name, and then Dan Williams on the other side of Dory in the 18th entry. Well, what does this mean? Well, the butts supplied the answer. Apparently the Drakes had a dory, and it was a fairly good sized one. They took pretty good sized crowds out in it. And this shows the dory down in front of the Williams and Shackford and Richardson cottage, with Dan Williams standing up in the center. I don't see any oars. I don't know how they got it. Jimmy Thurston had the Blaisdell brothers build him the Snipes sailboat, Snipes class. That's Jimmy. Jimmy was a wonderful guy who worked at Ironworks, I believe. His father was a fisherman out of Rockland, and Jimmy married Almina Jakes, who was my history, Maine history and science teacher in 8th grade in Central Grammar. Jimmy was a very frugal guy. I remember when he used to buy lobsters from me, I was selling him 2 for $1 for a large one. He got the biggest ones I had, and I made sure they were hard shell. But Jimmy turned out to be quite a philanthropist. Jimmy died about 35 years ago, left his money in trust for people they cared about. But when they all died, the money came to the museum, and I believe it was over $100,000. Very nice. Arthur Sewell lived out at the Stonehouse. It was called Stonehouse Arthur. Had this rather boxy-looking yacht that he kept at the Hyde place when I first started going to Birch Point. Later on, Bear Conrad kept his yacht Ursa there. Those of you who are classic scholars know that Ursa means bear in Greek. And here's a little outing with Clarabelle Conrad on the left and Jim Maine, who was Archie Maine Jr.'s brother, on the right. Howard Mayo, Bath funeral director, called his boat Dry Bones. This boat went ashore during Hurricane Carol, unfortunately. Bill Drake had a couple of handsome sailors. He was an excellent sailor himself. And the Giles had a little cruiser they named Wib. Mary Giles' father and brother were presidents of the Bath Iron Works, and Wib is B-I-W backwards. My brother and Pete, as they got old enough, used to take cruises up the coast with Wib, and that's my brother's first wife, Gail. Fishing was, of course, a lot of fun at Birch Point. Catching tinker mackerel, you trolled for it. There's a story in 1884, 3 local men went down to Birch Point and caught 1,378 mackerel in one day, just by line and hook and line. Everybody, almost everybody down at Birch Point has lobstered one time or another. As kids used to think up all sorts of crazy things to do. We had an auction one time in Talbot's barn. I wish I could tell what it was we were selling. Then we had magic shows. That's Dick Redland watching his cousin Bruce get sawed in half. Now, right after the World War II, there were a lot of surplus stuff around. I bought a bunch of surplus Ranger badges that we had our mothers sew onto our sweatshirts. And we formed a group called the Birch Point Rangers. We were very serious about patriotism. And we didn't let girls in at first, but finally Mary Talbot's father bribed us to And we had a parade around 1945. That may have been VJ Day, for all I know. Then Haynes picked up on this parade idea. It wasn't following our idea necessarily. I think it was original to himself, but he decided in 1976, on the 200th anniversary of the Revolutionary War, to have this parade over on the Loop. And they even had floats. I like this one awfully well. George Langman's son. A very recognizable symbol. People just like to ride around, and his Dan Williams with his wife. And then Richard Bisson talked me into buying this Model A Ford for about $25, and we took the roof off because we like convertibles. And we drove all over the place with it, including going over to Elbow Hill, from Elbow Hill to Houghton's Pond through the woods. There's a little logging road in there. Guess that's the end.